Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in the series on cyber resiliency for defense contractors. My name is Connie Paluca. I'm the Vice President of Consulting at Catalyst Connection. We're a national non-profit consulting group, which is part of the National MEP Network. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our cybersecurity expert, who will be our speaker again this week, and that is Max Aulakh. He's the president of Ignyte Assurance Platform, and prior to joining Ignyte, he trained with the U.S. Air Force, where he maintained and tested InfoSec and ComSec functions of network hardware, software, IT infrastructure for global unclassified and classified networks. And with that background, there's no question in my mind that he's the perfect person to speak to us today. And we're going to be talking about DFARS and CMMC. Just a reminder that if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to type them in the questions function. And with that, Max, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connie, and thank you everyone for attending. If you missed our last session, I encourage you to listen in. We kind of covered some basic fundamentals. A lot of people had great questions, so please just anytime you have questions. I'm a big proponent of a bi-directional conversation so people can learn about what this is. So today we're going to dive deeper into DFARS, which is essentially, it stands for Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're going to look at specific rules of DFARS that are related to cybersecurity.
And Matt, I just want to mention that we can't see your slides.
Oh, you are not able to. Okay, thank you. I thought the screen was being shared, so thank you. All right, so how do I give us 1 second? There we go. Okay, all right.
Okay, and just put it on presentation mode.
Okay, thank you for, there we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so again, thank you everyone. So these are kind of the topics we're going to cover today. As Connie mentioned, ask any questions. These are really complex topics, even for cybersecurity professionals like myself. We're still learning things as things are evolving. So today's goal is for me to share what I know and what I've learned so far. And as we learn more, we'll share more through either Ignyte Institute or through Catalyst, whatever the mechanism is, or you can reach out to me directly. But we'll touch on what specific areas of DFARS that you should be worried about. Reason why we want to cover that is because that's really what your prime contractors or the prime in the DoD supply chain, that's what they have to comply with today. That's the current law. It's not up for a vote. It's already been approved. And so you as a sub or a small business, you have to comply with those things as well. We'll talk about emerging requirements within those legislations, things like that, and how you should manage those. Then the second area we'll spend a lot of time on is this category of data called CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information. There's another subcategory called CDI, Controlled Defense Information. There's CTI. There's a lot of acronyms, but we're really just going to break down how do you properly categorize different types of information. How does the DoD view it? How might your prime view it? And then what kind of structure it might look like for a small business. So we're going to take the large concepts and break it down for how, what information looks like at a very small business, things like that. And we'll cover COTS. We had a lot of questions about what is COTS product, what is not, and then also how does information coming out of COTS relate to this CUI, CDI scheme of things. So that's a really big, important topic. And then we'll break down what is CMMC, what components, what's the model, what's the architecture. That's what we'll cover for today. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in. We do have a lot to cover today, but we'll start with the DFARS. So here, the main reason why DFARS exist is because of the #1 concern that the Department of Defense has is around supply chain attacks, right? So one of the reasons that this rule came out is because all of us fall within the supply chain, and increasingly year over year, we have seen an increase in supply chain attacks and things like that. And so that was one reason. The second reason you could say is that small businesses, and especially defense contractors, you have all sorts of different innovation happening, right? Additive manufacturing to advanced manufacturing. We know that our country has gone through a major transition over the last 50 years where a lot of manufacturing has gone overseas. So now we are at a point where we're advancing and really integrating digital technology into into the manufacturing process, right? So a lot of that investment that is accelerating kind of the development of our country is being siphoned off in some way, and then some intellectual property is being stolen, and the government cares for that, not just because of small business, but just because of national economical interests and things like that. So something needed to happen, and so they created this legislation back in 2015-17 timeframe, and now they're trying to make a certification scheme out of it, right? So that's from kind of a global national perspective. But at the end of the day, when we look at it, very tactically, what does the government actually care for besides when it comes to your business, besides just national security interests and national economical goals, things like that? They really care for their information. And this category of information is called CUI. You'll hear that term. Some people refer it to as CUI. Some people call it just CUI. I call it just CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information. And the key word here is that it's unclassified information. When we dive deep into this, I'll share with you the categories of information from the defense perspective and where this sits within that. But controlled unclassified information is really, really important to the Department of Defense, and those are the reasons why you could say that requirements are coming out. So DFARS legislations overall, they play an important role in just acquisition, but now they're starting to play an important role in cybersecurity when you combine them with something called NIST, or NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. NIST does a lot of different things, but one of the things that they actually do really well, if you're a small business, you probably didn't know this, but they are kind of the leading standards body organization, even for cybersecurity standards and development. So a lot of the universities, when they're teaching about things, they're actually borrowing a lot of concepts from NIST in terms of how to develop cybersecurity schemes for DoD environments, for large commercial enterprises like Equifax and Target, and also for small businesses as well. So NIST has a huge influence in terms of how to do cybersecurity, and now both NIST and DFARS are kind of coming together. One is from a legislative perspective, the other is from a standards perspective, and that's really important to understand. Legislation you have to do. Standards, it's always up for a debate. There's always they could be considered best practices and guidances. So when we look at the CMMC, that's important to recognize that it's not just black and white. Depending on how your business is set up, NIST allows for tailoring of controls and modifying of the controls so that they fit your business, right? A lot of people come in and say, well, you just got to do this one thing and that's the only way to do it. That might not be 100% true. There's a lot of different ways to achieve cybersecurity in combination of people, technology, and the process that you implement. That's what achieves cybersecurity. So DFARS gives us a foundation for legal authority, and then NIST gives us a foundation for kind of the best practices, the standards, and the guidance you want to follow. And together, they are being applied to defense contractors. So what are the rules that we're going to cover today? And these are called 70 series rules. So the first and foremost is safeguarding defense information. We'll look at that. We kind of already touched on that. We'll also talk about cyber incident reporting. I'll mention that. I may not have that in the slide, but I'll mention what the government cares for in terms of incident reporting. And then the other one is on the right side, you see that notice of 800-171. So we'll talk about, what is 171, how does it relate to CMMC, because that's the last item on this list. And then there's something called 171 assessment requirements. The assessment requirements are different from the actual 171 requirements themselves. There's actually two different standards we'll talk about. The reason why I want to mention those is because today there's a lot of different pricing and a lot of different levels of effort that people are talking about. We want to cover what is important today for your small business and how might that evolve. And as things evolve, of course, cost picks up and the level of rigor picks up. But these are small changes in the language that can have a huge impact in terms of how much work do you actually have to do. So we'll talk about those things very briefly, but cover them in a way that where it makes sense to you. So the first one, safeguarding covered defense information. So CDI, it just basically expands the definition of CUI. And we'll talk about the CUI definition, but what I want you to understand that the CUI is a very broad category of information. That's what the government generally does. They'll just say, well, everything is CUI. They'll list out everything from financial information to serious information like weapon system information to kind of moderate information like healthcare information, you could say, right? And they'll say, well, everything is CUI, right? So they wanted to tuck this covered defense information into it. And what they're saying is that anytime this information is compromised, you have to report you have to provide a cyber incident report. In order to do a cyber incident report, you got to have a cyber incident plan. So that's one of the documentation you should have, one of the things you should do in your business. And in order to report a cyber incident, you have to report it into something called DIVNet. It stands for Defense Industrial Base Network. The idea behind DIVNet, it's just an idea right now, but let's say a small manufacturer gets compromised. Hey, we've been attacked, it's phishing, and we, through an investigation, we found out they took some of our data. You report it into the DIVNet. Now, the idea is that the government can take that information and in order to protect everybody, pass that information to another person in the network, another small business. The idea is to create some sort of a herd immunity concept. We're very much far away from that, but they're creating the legislative framework to do those kinds of things, right? So if a business gets compromised, then we report it, and then hopefully that helps out another business. Obviously, you don't want to, you don't necessarily want to help your competitors, things like that. So these are things that were raised during, any kind of creation of a legislation which says share information. But that's what the government came up with. Now, from a small business perspective, one of the things that you have to do, and this could be coming down from your prime or your main customer that you're working with, you need to get something called medium level assurance certificates. That's what this is tied to. In order to submit an incident, you have to have this token that basically allows you to get access to a portal inside a DIVNet so you can actually report an incident. And that medium level assurance token, it's about $300 to $400. Don't quote me, pricing changes, but it's good for about, if you buy for a year, it's good for a year, or you can get it up to 3 years. And you have to be a US citizen to get this token. I had to submit my birth certificate and also naturalized citizenship. I'm a naturalized citizen of the US. So you will have to submit some sort of a birth certificate or something that states you are a US citizen, and so you can receive the certificate. So if anything happens, you can report it back to you. I like to cover that because you have legislation, but then you have means and methods to achieve it. And when you receive information from your supplier, if they're talking about getting tokens, it's tied to this particular requirement. So the next one is notice of 800-171. So this ties, this basically says, all right, you have to do a NIST 171 assessment for the purpose of basically submitting what's called an SPRS score. And we talked about SPRS scoring last time, but this kind of further clarifies it that you have to do it every 3 years unless you're bidding on some sort of a solicitation. And that solicitation could be as a sub, or it could be as a prime. So every time you're putting in a bid or a quote, and this could happen a couple times a month, depending on your shop and your business cycle and your rhythm, you're supposed to update your score. What this basically allows us to do, last time we covered about scoring, it allows us to submit scores over and over as your posture improves, right? So the score, we talked about it, it's a point system. You can start really high, but then you can end up as a negative. And essentially, if you end up with a negative, that's okay. We talked about that last time, but the goal is that every time you're submitting, you want to show some level of improvement that you have done, because eventually the government will look at this as some sort of an evaluation for criteria, and that's why they're tying it to an actual solicitation or an actual RFP that they might have, right? So very important. We call this, in my firm, we call it a low fidelity assessment. What that means is that a very trained professional should be able to get this done for you within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks at the most, right? If they're trained. It's low fidelity, meaning we don't need to develop an SSP, but further down the line, you'll see that you'll start to see words like SSP or a POEM, then it becomes a moderate fidelity assessment, and we'll cover what that means as well. But this should be very rapid, very quick, easy for you to do, just so you can prove that you've done it, and then you improve your score from there on forward. So then you have other clauses that were created that basically reinforce the importance of SPRS, and then it also says, this clause specifically says, okay, you have now, it grants the government access to contractor facilities, right? Now, the government isn't gonna go out and inspect every single facility out there. They don't have enough money to inspect all the small businesses, right? But because they have the authority through this rulemaking, the authority can, a lot of times, and it usually is delegated to contractors or other entities. And that's the idea with CMMC, that they can actually conduct the inspections and things like that. If you're working in a cleared space, you've already experienced this. There's an agency, used to be called DSS, Defense Security Services, and for material that is classified, they actually come on site and conduct an assessment. So very similar pattern we're seeing for unclassified controlled information, but instead of the DSS doing this mission, they have an accreditation body, right? A group of volunteers that have formed a scheme, but a very similar pattern to what we have seen before. The other thing here that's of importance is this: a lot of businesses from many years ago, when this thing was first released, they would say, "Yep, we did it, and that's it, we're done." So now what they're saying is you need to make enough progress on your plan of action and milestone. You need to show continuous improvement. You can't just say that I did it and it's done. It's one of those things that's leading to what we call an ongoing program. It's not a project. A project has a start and a stop date. What the government wants you to have is a continuous program. It doesn't matter how big the program is or small, but they want you to start with a program, and then you improve that program, you increase the spend on that program depending on how well your business is doing, right? But they want you to get into a programmatic habit of managing this, and so this rule has some of those elements. And then the last one is, specifically calling out the DFARS, right? It basically or calling out CMMC within the DFARS legislation itself. So now we've got the SPRS tied into DFARS, we've got the NIST 171, and this new AB relationship that has created this cybersecurity maturity model now that cybersecurity maturity model is tied into the DFARS as well. So think of this, the best example I can give you is if you're AS9100 certified or quality certified, instead of that requirement being tied to a contract, it's actually tied in the law itself, right? So so now it means that an external entity like a CMMC or the accreditation body is allowed to conduct these assessments, and they're one of the only ones right now that are approved. There were a lot of questions asked, and they're still being asked. Hey, the single institution that is not the government can create rules for the market, charge money to the market. Who's going to keep them in check in terms of their competitiveness, things like that? Those are still being hashed out, right? But what we do know is that they have baked in CMMC directly into the DFARS rule, which means that it's here to stay. There's a group of people that I meet, they believe that this will all go away, but when something gets tied into the actual legislation like this, I have never seen it undone, and so it's here to stay. So the main takeaway from CMMC, they are reinforcing the idea of program, not a project, into a program, now institutionalizing, they call them cyber practices and processes, right? So the NIST terminology, they call it a requirement, now they're calling it processes, with the idea that it's ongoing and it's part of your normal business, just like any other quality system, financial system, cyber systems are part of your normal institution. So that covers kind of the basic primer of these rules. Again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm a cybersecurity professional by trade. I work with a lot of attorneys. As an information assurance officer, you have to work with attorneys, chief financial officers, and also technicians or technology officers, right? But the cybersecurity field is a combination of these three. When you need advisory on the legal, from a legal perspective, we do work with another attorney, prior military JAG, to help us kind of go through some of these things, the specifics of it. But we try to bring in the financial officer, the attorney, as well as the technology officer. It doesn't matter how big your business is or small. These are the three kinds of people as leaders that need to be communicating to make this happen. In your business, that might be a procurement person or a quality person or an IT guy or a gal, right? Doesn't matter. But these are the three different lines of disciplines that are coming together to form this new discipline of information assurance or cybersecurity versus only tech heavy. So now
Max, before we go into the next section, let me ask a question.
Sure.
This is from someone in our audience, that you mentioned the medium level assurance token. Where does somebody get that? Where do you apply for that?
Great question. So the medium level assurance token, there are 2 approved vendors in the whole world that are allowed to sell it right now. If you email me, I can get you those 2 vendors, and it's I can't remember the name of these 2 vendors, but those are the only 2 vendors that are allowed, and you can just purchase it right off online. So it's out on a government website. They tell you, hey, click here, and then you get routed to a website. So I apologize right off the bat, I don't have that name remembered, but you know, I will make a small video about this because this is an important thing. So we will go ahead and send you information regarding where you can get these medium level of assurance tokens. So. And
for everyone in the audience, I'll get those 2 vendors' names or the links for them and send them when I send out a copy of the notes from this or the recording.
Thank you, Connie. Don't let me forget that, because that is one of the things that everybody has to do, is get one of these tokens. So,
and actually, we had a couple more questions. So, IdenTrust, is that one of the vendors? Do you know?
Yes, thank you so much. Whoever typed that out, IdenTrust is one of them, and I think another DigiTrust or something else is another one. But we use IdenTrust. We're not endorsing them or anything, but they're both basically the same, the IdenTrust and the other one. But yes, IdenTrust token is what you need.
Okay.
Okay, so all right, so moving forward into CUI and this, you know, CUI or whatever people want to call it. and all the other types of information that the DoD releases to you. So before I dive into the fine print and what this is, I want us to kind of step back and look at things from the Department of Defense perspective, right? So the Department of Defense has what's called a classification scheme. And if you work for the government, you've heard, okay, I've got top secret, secret, confidential, or unclassified. Usually it's 3 tiers, right? And underneath these tiers, even within the top secret environment, you might have something called SCI, compartmentalized information of some sort, right? So underneath each tier, red, pink, green, you have sub tiers underneath it. One of those sub tiers is where really your CUI falls, right? So as you can see from their perspective, and a lot of these schemes get adopted into the prime vendors as well. So they could be a prime, they're actually the government, but sometimes this gets enforced on a prime as well. All information that's in the green, that's unclassified, usually is on a government network. That network is called NIPRNet. You might hear that term, and it stands for basically, I don't know what it stands for, but it's non-classified information. And most of your government people, most of your soldiers, they operate on an unclassified network. Whatever information that's coming out of that unclassified network. So when you're communicating with a Booz Allen, when you're communicating with a Lockheed Martin, you're coming from your unclassified network and you're sending potentially sensitive information, and that sensitive information could be FCI, federal contract information, like, hey, prime contractor, I want you to build a jet. Here's the contract information of that, right? That is sensitive information because it lays out specifications of that. And then out of that federal contract information, or FCI, the prime can produce something called CUI. Now, from how they produce CUI is when they're actually doing their work, where they're putting the pieces and parts together. Well, some of those pieces and parts really come out of all the machine shops and all the different defense manufacturers across the world, not just the United States, across the world. And so these are design specs. These are things that you normally get when you get an RFQ, right? These are drawings that you believe that belong to you, but they're really being provided to you so you can build a bolt, a part, whatever it is that fits into a bigger machine that you don't really quite understand what it is. So what the DoD is saying is that once this information gets marked properly, and they're really putting that onus on the primes to do, a lot of the drawings that you're getting today, they could be in the near future marked as CUI. Now, just because they're marked doesn't mean you have to protect them like it's a secret network or a top secret network. It just means that they're marked, and then you have to figure out what kind of protection scheme do you need to put in place, right? So a lot of people today believe that if it's CUI, it just needs to be heavily guarded. One of the videos I show out there is we visit an actual government website, we download information, and it actually is marked as CUI. What that tells us is that when the government is releasing certain kinds of information, even though it's public, it can be marked as CUI. You could also have public information that could be marked as CUI because maybe you just downloaded it and it's marked as CUI, right? So it's really important to understand that this is the lowest form of information, but doesn't make it less important or anything like that. You do need to put some protection boundaries around it, but one of the first things you should do for your business is what we call a data classification exercise. Towards the end of this classification area, the CUI, I'll show you what a sample of what a small business classification scheme could look like that you could adopt, that you could use and start to plug in CUI information, but also information like your employee data, your information like your pricing, whatever makes your business unique, whatever differentiates you, you want to protect that information. You just don't want to protect CUI information, right? So towards the latter part of this presentation, I will share with you what your classification could look like. So that's kind of the context, right? We're talking about the lower level forms of information, and we'll talk about what it is and how to generate it, how does it normally get generated, and then how you can do this for your businesses. So again, I'm not an attorney, but we always have to go to the source of what things mean. You can't just say from hearsay, well, Max said this, right? So this is the official definition that's actually in the law, and basically the takeaway for me is that information that the government creates themselves, obviously, or they have, or an entity creates or possesses on behalf of the government, right? And that entity could be a prime, a subprime, and that's, you know, that's basically what CUI is. Pretty broad, basically says government has it or creates it, or an entity creates it, and then, you know, you have to have some sort of controls around CUI, and as you disseminate that information, it has to have some sort of controls. So today, right now, you could say that because the definition is not very clear, it's very broad, right? So you could look at what it says in the actual law, but then when you actually look at it, you're like, okay, well, what does that even mean? The information that the government creates and gives it to a small business, that could mean many different things, right? So by and large, all of the assurance professionals that do this, they understand that you know, it's not very clear in things like that. The good news for small businesses is that they're really putting the onus of figuring this stuff out on your primes, and they are supposed to be conducting something called a damage assessment or a harms assessment that could, you know, have a national defense impact, right? So if you're a manufacturer and you're just producing these washers and bolts or whatever it might be, you're thinking to yourself, well, I sell this to my commercial business, but then I also sell it to the government. I don't know what they use this thing for that we produce. They could be using it for all sorts of things. So they're putting the onus on the damage assessment, harm assessment. A lot of this goes on the prime, is what I believe. And if the primes don't take care of it, the government will basically, you know, take another broad stroke and say, well, anything related to this large billion-dollar contract is CUI, and everybody on this contract needs to be level 3, right? When the government does that, it creates a lot of problems down the chain. So it's, in my opinion, it's only my opinion, it's in the best interest of the primes to really define that and control that in order to protect their small suppliers, because there's a lot of uncertainty on what is CUI, what is not CUI. But I'll share some examples of things that are out there. So I'm going to scooch back on the slide, but if you Google what is CUI, you'll come across a couple of different websites. One of those websites is called NARA, stands for National Archives Records Administration. I'm here in Dayton, Ohio, and there's actually a NARA headquarters, or not a headquarters, there's actually a NARA facility here, which basically is record archiving place. So NARA has the authority to define what CUI is, but it's primarily for the consumption of other DoD agencies, right? So when they're writing up a contract, they can just say, well, I'm referencing NARA, or they can create their own agency-specific CUI program. So right now, internally, there's changes going on in Department of Defense where you might start to see what's called contract modifications, where they're basically saying, oh, we created our CUI program. We now know what this means for our program, for our weapon system, for our mission, or whatever we're doing. And now that CUI program has been created, and they're modifying the contract language, and then they're providing you with what's called a security classification guide. That's what they're supposed to provide the prime. They're not everybody is able to do this right now, but that's what's coming up. That security classification guide is generally built by cyber professionals, threat professionals, and what they generally do is they say, okay, you know, if this information was to be compiled or aggregated in a certain way, what kind of, can it produce classified information if we put all the pieces together? And then also, can it create a harm to the national defense of our country? That's the kind of analysis they're doing, right? But this is done at a very high level, and they have no idea about a small business who just is building a single component. So it's in the best interest of everybody to do this kind of exercise amongst themselves to kind of come up with what might be a security classification guide. This is the process we walk through with small businesses. We ask them, okay, you've got your ERP system, but hey, do you really care for what's in there, or do you really care for your software processes that does the additive manufacturing? How can we conduct a mock-up harm assessment that can lead to CUI, right? Here, the government cares for classified information, but for a small business, you could do an exercise that could lead to CUI, right? So those are some of the things you wanna do, and these are the stakeholders, NARA and your primes. They're really the stakeholder, and the government themselves are really the stakeholders that are deciding on how to protect information or what kind of information needs to be protected. Because the key takeaway I want you to understand is not all CUI needs to be protected at the same level and at the same type, because we have information that we see out there that is marked as CUI. It's in public form. But really figuring out through a data classification scheme, what is it that actually needs to be protected is one of the first things you need to do when you're, before you start to implement technology. Because if you don't do this, you will overspend on your technology and you'll buy things that are really not adding any kind of protection when it comes to data. And that's what the government really cares for, is the data itself. So I'm gonna scooch back a little bit. So this just CUI exceptions. Obviously, it's not classified information. So one of the questions we ask folks is, hey, do you have what's called a DD-254 contract, which is basically a classified contract? So CUI does not include classified contracts. And there are, as I mentioned before, just because a CUI doesn't mean that you need to start doing something. Even within the legislation itself, they, at a very high level, they say, well, there's basically two types. There's basic, and then there's specified. Basic means no controls, you don't have to do anything. And then specified means you have to provide controls. And when we say controls, these are the practices you've been hearing about, the NIST 171, the CMMC. Those are the controls that people need to use. But if you have basic CUI, you don't necessarily need to know that, right? So that's important. Again, don't want to over-engineer your environment, don't want to make it complex, don't want to take it blindly, like, oh, I've got CUI, I've got to control everything. Not necessarily, because the government recognizes that for a small business, or for any business, large or big, it's difficult to control all levels of information, right? So, all right, so again, just kind of reiterating, right? Contracts must require aggregation and compilation, right? Based on its ability, the information's ability to generate classified information, right? That's what they care for. What you want to start doing and thinking about is when you compile information that is in your business. Let's say if you have 5 different lines of businesses and each one of them is put together for a torpedo system and then for some sort of a missile system, you want to start to think about those things basically across all of your lines of businesses, to think about, can it potentially create aggregate or compiled CUI? Once you figure that out, you can actually protect it, you can be proactive about it, you can even report it to your prime and go a little bit on the offensive and say, look, you don't need to regulate our business. We know what we need to protect. We've done this sort of analysis and we've got COTS products mixed in, and we know what's already on our website. People already know about it. Pricing is out there, right? People know what we sell. And so certain types of information, we don't need to protect it. Other types of information, we do need to protect it, right? So it's really important for you to do this analysis as a business before you say, well, I need to, again, take down my website, or I need to remove pricing, things like that, because as somebody mentioned last time, commercial off-the-shelf products, they fall under a different category that, and sometimes we see companies with both kinds of products, commercial and defense related products, but they're using the same technology, they're using the same manufacturing equipment to generate those kinds of products, right? So it's really important to do this analysis up front for your business, because the DoD is doing this analysis right now, and so are your primes. They're doing this kind of analysis for all of their programs. Okay, so these are just methods to determine, right? When I say analysis, right? In the government, they are, they've got a ton of money, they've got a ton of people, so they got teams doing all sorts of, harm assessments, damage assessments. They have these groups called OCAs, Original Classification Authorities. But for a small business, you can still do these things. It doesn't have to be that rigorous. It just has to be leaned out and done the right way, right? You just have to have a scenario, like you can do scenario based. You could do what if kind of information, right? What if kind of analysis. When we do these kinds of things as business leaders in our heads, we just have to kind of write it down that we did this sort of analysis, and that becomes your justification and rationale to protect what needs to be protected and not over-engineer things, and also not be negligent about it, right? Not saying not saying, well, I don't want to do this analysis, or hey, I've already thought about it, I don't have anything, and that means I'm just going to totally ignore it. That's not going to be good enough. You have to kind of defend and justify what you're doing and why you're doing it. A lot of times this information for a small business happens in their mind. An operations officer, CEO is doing this at all times. So we just need to write it down as risk management professionals and also as information assurance officers, right? We need to write these things down. So if something bad happens, you can back your rationale up why you didn't spend the money on technology, why you chose to separate your network, why you did not choose to separate your network. Your IT practitioners are looking for these decisions from you as a business, because guess what? They will spend the time and the money, but if you don't have some of these decisions up front, they could be wasting their time and money, right? A year from now, it could be like, well, I didn't know about this. So, but now I have invested, 100, 200, whatever money in setting up the infrastructure this way, but it doesn't match our business strategy. It doesn't match our protection scheme. So these are some of the things that we would ask you to conduct to determine if you potentially have CUI until it gets marked up by your contractors. All right. So so CDI, right? You can consider that is very similar, right? There's other subcategories. I'm not gonna beat this one to death like CUI, but for a small business, this could be very similar information or same kind of information, right? So a lot of this is going to be on it could be on your task order, it could be on your contract. I know a lot of small businesses, they're just getting a one-page RFQ. You submit your quote back to the prime, and then you get the designs back, right? So that works fine, right? You may or may not see CDI, but if you have a prime where you have a strategic relationship, and the dollar value is really big, and to the point that they're defining what you need to do in some sort of an extra scope, it's not just an RFQ, a simple quote, but it's an actual statement of work. You wanna protect that statement of work, because that task order, because to government, a task order could be something pretty big. That task order could also have sensitive information. Sometimes, they're also extending this to things called FCI, or federal contract information. The fact that I'm gonna tell you, Raytheon or Lockheed or whatever prime, that, hey, you're building a torpedo for me, and that torpedo is targeted towards this base, that's enough information to figure out what that torpedo or whatever who are they kind of putting that there for, right? What are they trying to protect us from? What kind of adversaries would actually go near that base or are close to that base because it's a naval yard, whatever it is. There's enough information to put together the scheme of protection of our country, right? So any defense information, federal contract information, that is also coming underneath the same kind of scrutiny. Now, a lot of large primes have to deal with this, and also a lot of large subs have to deal with this, right? If you're a sub that you know you're working within ordnance area, you're working within classified area, you might start to see some of this information, right? Those are the two lines of businesses that are going to be heavy impacted within the manufacturing space. If you have a DD-254 classified work, or if you have some sort of ordnance manufacturing, weapons manufacturing, doesn't even matter if it's regular guns, and maybe even logistics, armored vehicles, things like that, right? A lot of those businesses are, for many years, they've operated without having to deal with defense, and now this information is coming under scrutiny or protection scheme as well, right? So I'm going to skip over this, but because we already talked about this again, right? We've got these are the federal requirements that apply. We covered them earlier. The last thing I want to touch on in terms of information, the government has another set of information called distribution. So just like ITAR, right, there's also something called distributions. We don't quite understand if this distribution information, if it's marked as distribution ABC, if it's going to be merged into the CUI scheme. But if you have this information today, it means that you already understand some level of protection scheme required around it. I would consider distribution information as well as ITAR information. Maybe they will get merged into CUI. I'm still learning and waiting for guidance on the DoD side on the impact of different types of information, right? ITAR is for export control, no foreign environment, those kinds of things. And we're still waiting to see, certain types of CUI information could be very similar to that, right? Okay, so as I promised, for a small business, right, the government has their scheme, top secret all the way to unclassified. For a small business, you can have a 3 or 4 tier scheme. I highly encourage you to create a data classification before you do anything technology related. You want to, so let's say if we were to use this, restricted information could be your intellectual property. It could also be certain types of CUI that you are, could be contract information. It could be healthcare information of employees. It could be PHI. It could be social security numbers, right? And then all the way down to public information could be your pricing or your COTS information that everybody already has, right? Your marketing website, and then we would define the things in between, right? So this is the kind of thing you want to implement first, because this will dictate the flow of that information, who's allowed to have it, who's not allowed to have it, and this kind of guides the technology leaders on kind of building the scheme based on the data that you're trying to protect, right? Sometimes doing this work up front gives a lot of ideas and thoughts to technology teams on how they might bring about building a network, or how they might put a system together, right? If we don't provide this to them, the general trend we have seen, you just start to buy technology, you just start to implement things that are best practices from a technology perspective, but they're not best practices from information security and information assurance perspective, right? And information assurance, we consider it very closely tied to procurement, legal, finance, and then technology, right? Because they're tied closely to what your customer actually wants you to do, which is, it's always comes down to protect my information. I don't care for your machines. I don't care how much money you spend, what kind of computers you have, protect my information and where it goes. So if we can build a scheme up front and help out our technology leaders, they tend to appreciate it, and they have more guidance on what to do and how to do it, right? And the decisions you make become a lot more defensible. All right, so so Connie, just want to do a quick time check. How much time do we have, and do we have any other questions that have flowed in so far? I've got one other section related to CMMC.
We're doing good on time. It's 11:20. We have till 12.
Okay.
And we do have some questions. One of them is, let's see, what about if information doesn't flow down on the data, like prints or contracts? So I assume this is coming from the prime or from their customer. Should they still treat it as CUI?
I don't know. I don't understand that. So whoever wrote that question, please clarify. But I think what you mean is that what if the information does not flow down from the prime? Should you still protect it? So, you know, if we want to err on side of the caution, I would say yes. Yeah, absolutely protect it, because, you know, I don't know your business and things like that. So I would say, okay, protect it. But what the real answer is, have to do some sort of a harm assessment, damage assessment. What kind of information is it? Compilation, aggregation, and whatever you do, whether you protect it or not, or somewhere in between, the rationale for what you're doing should be documented. Because if somebody changes that decision, or you say I didn't protect it, whatever that decision is, you want to be able to defend that decision, justify that decision according to some of the guidances that I have written out, right? So hard for me to answer that question, but I think what you're saying is, I think that they don't send you anything. Maybe you just get a work order, and now you're just producing that item or whatever it is, right?
Or perhaps one way to look at this is, if you're working on a project that, you know, and your customer is handling CUI related to that project, whatever documents you receive from your customer, even if they're not marked as CUI, should you treat them as such?
Ah, okay. Today, I know none of the documents are marked as CUI.
Good point.
Yeah,
Or it's a mixed bag at best.
Yeah. So this is the big challenge right now, right? The government is telling you, go protect CUI and go do your controls, but then, you know, none of the stuff is marked. So what we're seeing today is that a lot of people are preparing and anticipating. So any of the drawings and things that you used to get, they could be marked, because not only the government is running behind on this internally, putting the programs on notice, but also the primes are trying to figure out which information needs to be marked, which does not information needs to be marked, because they know as soon as they mark it, you have to protect it. They have to check that you protected it, and that increases cost by a lot. So that's kind of their, you know, that's what they're going through. So today nothing is marked, but if you can be proactive from your side and start conducting that damage assessment, the harm assessment. You also want to look at your business type. If you're only selling, if your main customer is that prime or the DoD supply chain, that information most likely is going to be marked. But if you're split somewhere, right, or 15% business in the DoD and other percent not, that requires a more thorough analysis, because that other information could be, you know, COTS products and things like that, commercial stuff that you sell, right? But if you're like very close to the DoD supply chain, like 80%, 90%, most of that information, it'll need to be protected. So I'm just giving you some insight based on how we do the analysis, depending on how much revenue and the sources of that revenue, to you know, make a preliminary determination, a provisional determination on this kind of information. But today, nothing is, you know, there's very little that's marked today.
Okay. Another question is there overlap between itar and cybersecurity? So if something is itar controlled, does that automatically mean that it's CUI and requires cybersecurity protections?
So there is an overlap. We actually do, this is one of the first things we do, is we gather all of the other requirements that you have to comply with. ITAR has foreign control kind of requirements, and ITAR also has, I would say, general requirements of cybersecurity. meaning the hurdle to comply with itar is really low compared to CMMC. But once you get on the debarred list, meaning, hey, you violated itar, to get off that list, it can take 5 to 6 years, and then you need an attorney involved, right? So, and I've been through one of those deals too. So those things do come together, and generally an itar environment has no foreigners. CUI, it's unknown as of right now on how closely that's going to match to an itar's environment. If you're familiar with itar, I would implement that sort of scheme, but no foreign, those kinds of things, they are yet to be determined. And also itar has, like I mentioned, a very general cybersecurity requirement, very loose control structure, if any, whereas CMMC and NIST 171, I mean, it's pretty tight in terms of the controls and things like that. So those are the big differences, and there's definitely overlap between the two.
Yeah, I agree. I'm the itar expert at Catalyst. And if you look at a phase diagram, you have itar in one circle and CUI in another circle, and there is some overlap, but it's not completely overlapped. So there's a little bit. So that gets back into your investigation and really thinking about the information that you have that's maybe itar controlled. Is it, how sensitive is that information?
Yep, and sometimes, depending on the shop, the biggest issue I've seen, Connie, is that small businesses, we are not an issue, but small businesses have a lot of shared, we call them shared services, shared technology, shared HR, shared procurement, right? Because you're trying to reuse that same resource, technology resource, and human resource to accomplish many different things, right? So sometimes a carve out of technology or a business can happen. Other times, depending on how well your itar environment is structured, it might be beneficial to implement CMMC within there, right? All depends on your business, your own supply chain, what you're doing, how you're doing it. But a lot of times we can re-leverage itar. Just totally depends on how serious you took that commitment of itar when you and the scope of the itar work that you're doing.
Correct. Another question is, we are a small company of 26 that deals direct with the DoD thermoforming acrylics, so we are the prime. We do download drawings from the DoD site. Since we download this data, would it be considered CUI?
If it's not marked, right, I'm of the opinion that you need to follow exactly what it says. Don't overdo it. If it's not marked, it's not. The DoD, I know DLA as one of the agencies that's moving a little bit faster than all the other, agencies out there, and then GSA is trying to make moves as well, Navy as well, but DLA has really put a lot of folks on notice. As of right now, like I mentioned, right, they are supposed to be doing an assessment based on the program, a harm assessment. So if you haven't seen any markings, you could be proactive. You can, if you have that direct relationship, I would almost inquire, carefully inquire, so you don't incur more regulations than you have to. But yeah, that's we have a direct relationship with the 16 Cyber Command, and we do inquire through kind of back channels and just informally asking, hey, can any of this information be considered sensitive, without mentioning the word CUI. And then you can ask them if so, are there any other protection schemes that are required beyond what I'm already doing, right? That's how you kind of get insight without telling them, hey, is this CUI? Because once they learn that, they will start to enforce you and not and everybody else over time. What you want is that enforcement across the board, because usually that's when you'll start to see, like, increase of your overhead wrap rates allowed, things like that, right? So yeah, if you're getting information directly from the DoD, it's not marked, take it as that. They have a lot more resources to do their homework and mark information than a small business, right? So kudos to you for asking that question. But I guess, like the saying goes, don't poke the bear, just investigate it, but not necessarily say, hey, is this CUI?
Okay, that's all the questions we have for right now. Everyone, continue to add your questions and we'll address them at the end.
Okay, awesome. So I think we've got about 30 more minutes. I'll try to cover this section in about 20 minutes, and then we'll recap and answer the rest of the questions. So this one is, what is CMMC, right? I'm going to cover what is CMMC, and I'm also going to cover the difference between CMMC and NIST. But the details of this, right, how to build an SSP, what it actually goes inside of some of these things, there's a separate class you can sign up for. It's on the Ignyte Institute. I'll talk about that as well. But I'm going to give you some insight, things you need to know about CMMC, what we understand it to be, and as things evolve, right? So CMMC, at the core of it, right, you'll hear these levels. What level do I need to be? Level 1 through 5, right? And those levels are a combination of, you could call practices. Those are things you need to have in a business, and they all fall within these 17 big categories, they call them capability domains, right? Meaning you need to have the ability to demonstrate some of these capabilities, right? So it goes everywhere from access control to all the way down to recovery. Now, what's really important about this as an insight piece is the order of execution matters here, right? You can't just say, let me just do access control first. In fact, that's first because it starts with an A to some degree, right? Or let me start with physical protection first, or let me start with personnel protection first, right? One of the most fundamental categories we start with is, you could say, risk management, right? That's RM. So when we talk about damage assessment and harms assessments and making sure that you have a program in place, institutionalizing it, and really, getting the management approval before you start to spend technology, a lot of those concepts are alluding to risk management. When the CMMC talks about risk management, it has hints and elements of business level risk management, but a lot of it is geared towards technology risk management. Like, hey, I do a scan and I found this little vulnerability. Does this vulnerability create a risk for me? Oh, yes, it does, because it can exploit some server. But you as the IT practitioner may or may not have any idea on the business importance of that server. How much value does that server or that machine or that business unit or that entire system generate for your company, right? And that information is usually lacking, right? So what I tell people is that when you look at these categories and the controls, they're all important. Just like, if I consider it to my family, like, hey, my kids have to go to school, they have to brush their teeth and all of this stuff. It's all important, but the order of execution is really more important, right? They have to get ready before they go to school, things like that. So one of the things that I don't like about the CMMC and the NIST, and actually every framework out there in cybersecurity, the order of execution is generally missing. So one of the first things you want to do for your business, you want to figure out the order of execution for these families and controls, and layer this technology changes in. So just like maintenance cycle, you want to layer that in with your regular technology cycle, right? Personnel security, you might want to layer that in with your your HR department if they're already doing background check, things like that, right? Whatever cycle they're using to spend that time, you want to integrate that in and really do it from just an order of execution standpoint. So these are the domains. Underneath the domains, you have, we call them requirements, and CMMC uses another terminology, maybe capabilities, but essentially those are the things that you have to do. And then depending on how many of those things you choose to do, that's what determines if you're going to be a level 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, right? So today, we have been hearing all about level 3, but it could be that your business only needs to be level 1, right? And behind those practices is what they call them, the things that you have to do. They define different levels. Like, easy for an executive to understand is basic hygiene. Hey, just kind of getting up and putting your clothes on, brushing your teeth, that's basic hygiene. They call that the basic cyber hygiene. There are 17 things you have to do in those in that category. And then it evolves from there, it builds, right? It goes from 17 to 55 and then, 130, right? We stopped kind of at 130 because I'll talk about this in a minute, but all of those practices are you could say they're verbatim copied from NIST 171, except for about 20. That's why a lot of people are confused about CMMC and the difference between NIST 171. When you look at the content, you're like, man, this just says the same thing. What CMMC does is it allows us to mature, and then it allows us to actually put a scheme around it, a certification body around it. Whereas the NIST has no certification body for 171, and then also, it's controlled heavy by the government. The idea is that it should be controlled. That's the idea. It should be controlled by the industry, and that's what they're trying to figure out, right? So if you want to dig deeper into each one of these, and of course, if you've got any specific questions, please feel free to type them in. But if you want to dig deep into each one of these, you can start with a CMMC document, or you can start with NIST 171 document, and either documents will get you about 80 to 90% there. The reason why I say 80 to 90%, because things are still being heavily contested, right? In terms of some of these practices, are they in, are they out, things like that, right? So, yep.
From what I've heard, probably 60% of manufacturers in the DoD supply chain will probably be at level 1, 10% level 2, 20% level 3, and the remaining 5 to 10%, 4 and 5. Would you agree with that?
TBD, that's what we want to hear, is that most of them should fall in level 1. But here's the thing, Connie, this is kind of conflicting guidance I've been hearing. So who determines what level it should be on? A lot of that gets determined by the business themselves based on the competitiveness and all this other stuff, right? But really, it's going to come down to what we've been hearing, is that the contracting officer will put the requirement in the contract, right? So if we're on a large prime contract, building some sort of a crazy system, they're gonna put, hey, everybody needs to be at level 3, right? Now, what we don't understand is, do they give autonomy to the prime to say that everybody that they work with needs to be at level 3? Or do they not give that autonomy to the prime, right? So though the DoD is projecting what the expectation is, the market kind of determines who is going to actually do what, right? And so right now, again, if the government doesn't want to do that much work, sometimes they'll just take we call it the high water mark, just like what they did with CUI. Here's a big category of CUI, everything is CUI, right? So our fear is that the contracting officers would say, I've been hearing a lot about level 3, and I've looked at the requirements, and there's a million there's like 100 subcontractors on this. They kind of touch all the information. I've done my damage assessment. I'm just going to modify this contract to include level 3. That's the normal behavior. But what we are waiting for is that, are they going to give autonomy to the primes to determine if their subs need to be at what level, right? That's what we're waiting for. So yeah, this is a big giant experiment. I tell people, get ready for level 3 if you're serious about growing in DoD from a competitive positioning, from proactive standpoint. But it could absolutely be that business does not need to be at level 3, and they really only need to be level 1. It because of the contracts that they're on only requires level 1. So I go back to if you're doing anything within DoD that's touching weaponry, that's touching logistics, that's you're building components for aircrafts and any of those kind of things, just prepare for level 3. But if you're not, if you're like, yeah, I teach, I actually worked with a pilot, and that's a pretty serious kind of thing because they're used to it with sensitive equipment, but he's an instructor. Like, well, all I do is teach other pilots. I get no equipment, nothing. It's my curriculum and I teach them. And you know, for somebody like that, if it's your content and you're just teaching and all you're going to get is a quote to come on site and teach, I would say, you know, level 1 maybe makes sense for them, because you're never going to be getting any equipment. But if you're manufacturing goods and they touch the supply chain and you want to be competitive, we encourage you to go towards level 3, but really the contracting officer will make that determination and then provide that autonomy or lack thereof to the prime, and that's what's going to trickle down. So kind of a long answer, Connie. I hope it explains it, but in terms of numbers, that's what the DoD is projecting, but it all falls down when the contracting officer starts to modify things.
Thanks.
Okay, so about 10 more minutes we'll spend. So the basic relationship, obviously all of the content that's coming in from CMMC is ported over from NIST 171. There are new versions of NIST 171 coming out all the time, so the accreditation body is expected to keep that up to date. And of course, there's additional, you've heard this a lot, there's additional 20 practices, or you could say, you know, additional 20 requirements. Those are still in draft, they're still being contested. And right now it says NIST 171 R1. There's already a revision 2 out there. So NIST has a lot more money, a lot more power, horsepower to continuously develop standards. That's what they do. So they're going to push forward, and the AB is expected to kind of keep up to date with it. With its current staff is all, you know, I think they have very little paid staff. That's new to them. They got a new CEO recently, I think 4 days ago or so. And a lot of them are still in the volunteer state, right? So they're going to have a tough time keeping up. That's why I say all of that stuff is still being contested, because we haven't really figured it out in terms of the model. But NIST 171 is pretty straightforward, easy to understand in terms of what is expected, what is not expected. The CMMC, we're still learning as things evolve. So the big question, what level is right for your business? I'll get through this very quick. Somebody asked about itar earlier. That's excellent. One of the things we ask about is, hey, how much of your business is government? Have you done government before? Have you, you know, we call it pre-diligence. Do you know what RMF is, risk management framework? Does your business do risk management framework for the government? Have you done any FedRAMP, right? So these are some, you could say, alphabet soup, key terminology, things that we generally look for. And if the answer is no to most of these things, it makes life simpler and easier. Then after that, we kind of jump into business requirements, right? Kind of looking at, can we reuse any kind of itar environment? Can we reuse a low fidelity score that you may have done? Do you have existing corporate risk processes? If you don't, that's okay. Hey, let's create them for a small business. For a 20-person shop, we're creating some of these things for them in order to re-leverage some of the things that they might already be doing from a business requirement standpoint. And then after that, right, the goal should be to create efficiencies, right? Well, what you don't want is operational inefficiency, because from an audit standpoint, that's not going to pass. Meaning, if you got 2 emails and the government is going to send you an email, a contract over an email that's separate than your NIST email, there's no way the government knows, or your prime may or may not know. So, you know, a lot of technology carve-outs, we see sometimes they're operationally inefficient, meaning that they work as a good idea, but then when you start to use them, they either don't get used in the intended way, or it's a complete waste, right? So that's the kind of the process is pre-diligence. Look at, you know, what you're already doing in terms of regulatory compliance. Then after that, look at your business requirements, and then really try to, you know, bake some of these things into your existing people, process, and then technology, right? Remember my comment about institutionalizing, not a project, not a program. So in order to do these things, you have to start with the people side. You have to start with the business side first, or else it'll become a technology project. You'll buy things, you won't feel assured about the path you have taken, and it's very hard to defend yourself when it's time for the audit without the business justification on the decisions you made, right? So so again, some of these elements are things we talked about today, right? We talked about understanding information, understanding CUI, understanding flow of information from your contract down, doing a damage or harm assessment, anticipating, right? Like business professionals do, they anticipate growth in certain areas. They anticipate a down cycle based on who's in the office, who's not in the office, right? You have to anticipate those things and then start to create your technology and process around it, right? So those are some of the things we try to do very much upfront before we ever say, hey, change that password or anything like that, right? Because we don't quite know how much reusability we can have, and those are some of the things for a small business. It's critical. We want to save money and time. Reusability of your existing resources beyond IT is the key. So, all right. So I'll touch on this. The reason why I covered this, a lot of people asked us last time, hey, what's the cost? What's the cost? 3 cost factors: program management, tech engineering, and audit and certification. These numbers that I'm presenting to you, these are actually right out of the Federal Register, right? Small businesses are expected to spend like 60 grand or something like that. But when you go out to the market today, you're going to see all sorts of crazy pricing from 20K to 200K. But you know, not saying that price isn't justified. What we do encourage you to ask is, as you're learning more about this, you know, inquire, what is it that you're actually getting? Are you getting boxes? Are you getting servers? Are you getting machines? Are you getting, you know, the program management side, right? And nobody should be asking you to pay for audit and certification. But the way we tell folks to look at this is, these are the 3 cost factors: program management, the business side, tech engineering. Here you could already be spending money. You know, most businesses today have a firewall. So, you know, there's a cost expectation to maintain that and then maybe increase it. And then later on, sometimes in the future, right, you will have to pay somebody else to do the audit and certification. So when you look at this, look at it from a total cost of ownership standpoint, right? Don't be a business that just says, well, I know I need these firewalls and things like that. Don't leverage technology don't leverage this thing for a technology upgrade, because what you, as a tech leader, I've seen people do this. They will leverage a crisis to get what they need, but then what they are implying to their leadership is that we're 100% secure, we're 100% compliant, right? And I've seen some of my friends, they're chief security officers, right after a breach, they get a budget, a big budget, millions of dollars, then they use it up, and then what they have implied to their management is that they're secured, and then they get breached again. And now that security leader is no longer there because they've been released, right? So when you draw funds for whatever activity, understand that activity, communicate that activity to your leadership clearly, so you're not implying that you are going to get an audit and certification out of this, right? And make sure your vendors are not doing that to you either. We're in line to become an audit body and things like that, an inspection body. But even today, we don't offer any, you know, nobody should be offering you audit and certification services. So that cost is pushed out, unknown. Technology, nobody really knows that until they come inspect your business. Sometimes they call it a gap assessment. That gets pushed out because we scope that properly. And then program management cost kind of comes up early. One of the first things you might pay for is just a rapid, hey, get this SPRS off my back, right? So those are some of the first things that you should be spending money on. But this is kind of the range, and we put a lot of uncertainty because some of these requirements are still emerging, so businesses don't really know how much the total cost is going to be. But we do ask you to kind of build a program and have a stepwise cost approach, right? What you're spending today will most likely increase, but just time the investment versus saying, hey, if I do this thing for 100K or whatever it might be, I'm set for life, or I'm set for many years. That's not true, right? So be cognizant of that. We can certainly help you out, figure out a lot of these numbers. We obviously have a platform, so we understand what people are doing, how much time they're spending. We understand it down to the details in terms of the activity. And so we can help you at least develop a budget and build out the program. And later on, when we understand things better, we'll understand TAC and audit certification costs as well. So, okay, so additional program resources. I want to mention this because it's important. We talked about CUI today. Last time somebody asked, you'll get these slides. There's the DoD training website. That's one of the first things you want to do is take that extensive CUI course. It teaches you how to mark information. So whoever asked, do I need to mark information? If you do start seeing markings, but also your customer tells you, this DoD training website actually teaches you how to do the marking properly, right? Everything from fax machine marking to digital markings. So take some of that training for that. It's completely free and it's pretty new. It's on usalearning.gov. And then if you want to dive deeper into the practices, like what is access control, what is risk management, we break down each and every practice at the Ignyte Institute. Go ahead and sign up for that course as well. And then rest of the resources are out there for SSPs, guided assessments, and then and then the training resources provided by NIST as well, right? So that's the kind of the course, right? Very important course, because today we talked a lot about legislation, but really it's all pointing to data. They don't care for your machines. They don't care for computing resources. They really care for your data. So, or the data that the government has completed. So I highly encourage you to complete the CUI training. Brief preview next week. We'll talk about how to set up your program at a corporate level. We'll talk about how to conduct this rapid assessment for generating a score. We'll dive into that. We will talk about an SSP and a POAM. The reason why we want to talk about these things, because when we talk about a corporate program, that could be a long kind of thing, but your business is being pressured to submit an SPRS score. So we're going to talk about what it is and how to generate it. How does the scoring work? What are things you need to do? Call it very rapid. Then after that, soon after you're done with that, your prime is most likely going to send you an email with an attachment saying, have you done an SSP? And how many POAMs do you have? How long is it going to take? Those are some of the things we're seeing. So we want to cover that session. If you're a small business struggling with those, I encourage you to dial into the next session next week, same time, so that we can cover some of these critical topics that you're dealing with right now today as you're managing your prime relationship. So with that, I'll hand it over to Connie. We've got a little bit of time left to answer some questions and any additional items that we should be covering next week or the following. Please feel free to type them in.
Just one question here. You mentioned you had the slide that had the costs, and there was one column that said yearly assessment costs. So that's not the CMMC assessment. That's just, are you referring to an assessment of your system, an outside assessment? Is that a best practice?
So those numbers, right? There's a whole methodology that the DoD put out, and the link is in there. You can even see the rates they use, like $90, which is completely lowballing for the requirements that they're putting in, to like $150, right? So the assessment right now, I believe the DoD conducted, the way they did it, I think they conducted a low fidelity assessment. They did not, I don't believe that they conducted CMMC level assessment, because when this came out, this was in November, and then the CMMC guidance and the test cases actually came out sometimes in December. That's for public consumption. Obviously, they might have had them before, things like that, but what I believe they're basing those numbers off of is kind of a low moderate fidelity CM or NIST 171, which we'll cover next week. And that assessment, whether it's internal, external, lot of the small businesses, it's going to become an external cost because you don't have an information assurance officer on staff today. Most small businesses cannot afford it. But you could do it yourself. We're going to talk about how to do those things yourself, but it requires knowledge beyond just IT to interpret it correctly, knowledge beyond just legal to interpret it correctly. Those numbers, think of them as, you know, the level of effort and resourcing, right? Now, whether you own that resource or somebody else owns it, that is independent. There are some things in that area where the DoD said that the assessment will cost about $3,000. That's the actual certificate from the AB, things like that. That could be potentially true because it's easier to critique than it is to create. So if you've done all the right things, I know as a well-trained assurance officer, it's easy for me to go through your system because it's already set up. But if it's not set up properly, that assessment is no longer truly an assessment. It becomes a consultation engagement of some sort, right? So that's how the DoD looks at those numbers, as like, oh, well, the paperwork's filled out, I just need to check it. That should not take me more than 10 hours. And, you know, for 10 hours of your time, hey, it's $90 an hour to the government. So, you know, that's $900. That's kind of that's the calculation that they did, right? So that assessment can be internal, but then this C3PAO, that is the actual audit, that absolutely has to be external. Everything else can actually be done internally if you have the resources and the expertise to do it.
Okay. Another question is, you say the prime should define what they are providing as CUI. In our case, the prime claims everything is CUI, and we must be level 3. Being a small company, CMMC level 3 will take a lot of time and money to address all the control families. My question is, how does a small business claim level 3 when items are not applicable in their environment, such as using an enclave?
Right. The enclave strategy is a good strategy. But if you're prime, so again, my question, you know, I would ask the business, okay, how much of your business comes from that prime, right? If it's considerable, 50 to 80%, you might want to, you know, redo your network, right? But if it's not that much, then potentially an enclave could work with certain administrative processes and controls, as well as technical controls and things like that. But yeah, if your prime is telling you everything is CUI, they're kind of taking the most conservative route that they can, which is okay. Some smaller primes do that because smaller primes, if they don't take care of it, they're going to get gobbled up by the larger primes. But you still have to look at it like, how much do you rely on that prime from your business revenue to dictate your business strategy, right? If you are relying heavily on that prime, yeah, you should kind of do what they tell you because they're basically your source of income. But if you're not, then you can redesign your network because you might have a commercial business unit. I don't know, right?
Yeah, and actually their prime is saying the CMMC level is trickle down. In other words, since they need to be CMMC, all their subs need to be CMMC or need to be level 3.
Yeah, so that I have not, that's new to me, Connie, because from what I've heard is that right now the contract is being modified for existing legislations, which is NIST 171. Once they start to trickle down, specifically call out CMMC level 3, what we're waiting for is if they're going to give the autonomy to the prime to redefine what their subs need to be. That I'm always learning more things, and if that is happening from the prime perspective, that's a very conservative view, and the more conservative they are, the harder it's going to be for the smalls, right? And generally that's how they do start. Like, I can imagine that happening where the contracting officer says, this whole program, weapons program, yeah, it's sensitive, half of it is classified, the other half, the bar is just going to be level 3. And if you're one of the 100 suppliers that's building some widget for it, I could see that scenario happening. But again, you know, think about how much do you rely on that prime to dictate your technical strategy, if it should be an enclave or if it should not be an enclave. Creation of an enclave is really easy. Maintenance of it is a nightmare, right? So I can create an enclave very fast. And for those listening in, an enclave is basically like a specialized box or a network that's dedicated for just processing CUI, right? And it's got a very tight boundary. Easy to build, but hard to maintain.
Another question is, will COTS providers be required to be certified to, say, level 1 or any CMMC level?
To be determined. We don't know. A lot of people are advocating that they should after the SolarWinds breach, because SolarWinds is a COTS product. But as of right now, it doesn't. There's no linkages. But like I mentioned last time, if you're a COTS provider and your solutions is being packaged up in something that is non-COTS, that the government is building themselves or the prime is building, if the government is building, it's called a COTS, government off the shelf. It just depends the target deployment of your solution, if you're going to be enforced to do it or not. If it's 100% COTS, like there's a lot of gray area in this. If it's 100%, there might be a way to say, yeah, we're truly a commercial company, non-defense related stuff, and government just happens to buy us on a credit card. I could see, yeah, you just may need level 1 or not need it at all. But by large, manufacturers, we believe we're in COTS. We want to believe we're in COTS, but there's a lot of gray area. We're using that as an advocacy point to reduce the amount of burden you have to bear. So,
okay. One final question. We do download Boeing Wright's guard drawings and specs. Would these be considered CUI, or would Boeing have to specifically state that they're CUI?
They should be specifically stated. Again, I erring on the side of caution. If it's technical drawings and machine kind of things that you might feed to build a part, if it's only for Boeing and you're not building that part for anybody else, just be proactive. That's what it's going to end up being. And as you go through that DoD training, they actually talk about some of the drawings and things like that as well. So for detailed kind of training on that and topics related to that, I encourage you to take the DoD training, which is freely available, which goes through this kind of information.
Okay. And actually, I do have one more question. When do you think the CMMC regulations will be finalized so that all the questions will be answered? Such as when would it be March, SUI, and which CMMC level is going to be required? And
we don't know. Get started on it, right? The DoD is, I'm seeing more transparency than I ever have, if I'm being honest here. Usually you get told, and then after that, you got to do it, right? Here, there's a lot of transparency, which means there's a ton of scrutiny. People are not liking what the AB is doing. AB may not be liking what the DoD is doing. So we're able to see what's actually happening. They got a new CEO. So, my projection is that the Biden administration cares for cybersecurity. So did the Trump administration cared for it. There's money set aside for it. So we're thinking in the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to start seeing provisional assessors approved. And soon as they're approved, they basically got to go, they got to go certify, right, people. So in 3 to 6 months, whether we have clarity or not, the expectation would be is go get certified, go get certified. Whether we have clarity or not, go get certified. That's what we're noticing on our side.
okay. With that, we've run just a few minutes over, but it's really good questions. Max, thank you as always. Everyone, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Have a good rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.